Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
Good morning. You're listening to The Weekly with me, Sam Marshall, and we're in Heritage Month this month, for those that don't know, and I thought it would be important to have this conversation. I've come across these books, and I've been absolutely blown away with the amount of detail in relation to some of the stories that heritage publishers have managed to get their hands on and tell South Africans. And I honestly believe that it's not the common story that you pick up every day that you find in the supermarket, but stories that really shape our mindsets and our ideas. And on the line, I've got Terence Ball, who he'll clarify for me in a couple of seconds just kind of the role he plays, but I think he's the owner of Heritage Publishers. Terence, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me. And just tell our listeners, I mean, how did you come up with this idea of telling the kind of stories that we as South Africans really need to be talking about?
Morning, Sam, and to the listeners, thanks very much for this opportunity. Well, I've been fortunate enough over the last 30 years to travel extensively through Southern Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, and South Africa. And about 4.5 years ago now, 3 friends and I were sitting in the small rural village of Vuwani in the northeast of Limpopo, where sadly most of the trouble is happening now. And 2 of them were Chitsonga speakers, or are Chitsonga speakers, one of Amashangan heritage, the other Vatsonga, and Konanani Mativa, Chivenda speaker. And they were asking me about the history of the first contact between their ancestors and the role of the Portuguese in those meetings. And I had found out that Lukati van Taban, that Vuwani, about 110 years ago, was called Lukati van Taban. And I asked them who Taban was, and they looked at me blankly. And I teasingly said to them, it surprises me that people who are so respectful of their ancestors know so little about what they did. And Konanani said to me, you know, Terence, you are right to scold us, but you know something about our languages, you know a lot of the history of our people, you know schools, you know publishing, why don't you do something about it? And so it was that challenge in Vuwani that led to the publication of the Our Story series.
Now, Terence, you know that there are a lot of challenges that you can quite happily take on. But telling a story, stories like this, where do you even begin? Because, I mean, the list of stories that you've managed to tell over the last couple of years is absolutely mind-boggling. Where do you even begin to start telling a story?
Well, Sam, thank you for that grand praise. I'm not sure I'm worth it. But as I said, I have traveled and I've spoken to Chitsonga speakers, isiZulu speakers, isiXhosa speakers, you name it, Chivenda, Ndebele. A lot of people confuse South African Ndebele and the descendants of Mzilikazi Kamashobani now living in Zimbabwe. And so I've heard a lot from the people that I credit in the front of every book that I publish.
Yeah.
And it was listening to their stories and having an interest in languages. I was in Tulamahashi many years ago and heard Chitsonga being spoken for the first time. And the similarities to isiZulu sort of caught my attention. And I tried to find out why it should be that Chitsonga had been influenced by isiZulu. And of course, that led me to the Battle of Mhlatuzi River, which has its 200th anniversary next year, or thereabouts, along with a number of other events described in the Our Story series. And so I told the story of Mzilikazi Kamashobani, who fought on the side of Shaka for the Mtetwas against the Amandwandwe, Zwide Kalanga, Shoshangan, Kangomalo, and Zwangindaba Kajele. And so I followed the roots of Mzilikazi's journey from KZN all the way up to Zimbabwe. And then I looked at Shoshangan, his son Muzila, and his grandson, Muzila's son, Gugunyane. And that's how it started. And then obviously looking at other great leaders such as Makoma, Mahoba up in Limpopo, Sekukuni, and Moshweshwe, and others.
Now, I have to openly admit that You know, I actually got to speak to. I interviewed you on a TV show a while ago, and I got a couple of copies of your books, and I started reading it to my children, and obviously, quite understandably, I got to this idea that I know very little about the actual history of South Africa and the influences on where we find ourselves now in this modern South Africa. Were you surprised? And I know you recount that story where you were sitting in this group and not chastising them too harshly for not really understanding their history, but how common is it that we as South Africans, as Africans, don't really know our history?
I think sadly it's very common. Obviously, you will know as a country we are still divided by poverty and distance. And if I were to greet somebody using Tshivenda in, say, Xalo or Zimbabwe, I would be asked if I come from a foreign country. So we will find that people in the Eastern Cape know relatively little about their own heritage, but know almost nothing about the heritage of fellow South Africans, such as the Chitsonga, Tshivenda, etc. And I hope that this series will be an opportunity for South Africans to learn about one another, because if we are to build a more socially cohesive society, I can hardly think that there's anything better than teaching South Africans a few words of other languages spoken in the country and something in the past, something about the past of the people that live in the country.
Now, I can only imagine that when you do something as amazing as this, where you are documenting a history, where you are doing some real research, trying to get to some of those forgotten stories, as you just alluded to now, there must have been some challenges. And those challenges don't only come from people within the various cultures and the stories you're trying to tell, but I think public at large. What were some of the challenges that you experienced putting this series together? Terence?
Well, I think our greatest challenge is finding the right authors to tell these stories, and also, obviously, finding the right people to be the content editors of these stories. We use both academics and also who are not qualified historians to write the stories from the source material provided. Once that has happened, the materials are then read by an English language editor to ensure that the level of the materials is appropriate, and we are targeting the younger reader. And then it must go to a content editor to check that the facts are correct. So, finding the authors is a challenge, but as the series gets more publicity, so we are being approached. And then the next challenge is the sheer wealth of stories, to be frank. I'm currently sitting on a list of 80 people and or events, whose stories I would like to tell. The rebellion of Langalibalele, all sorts of things. I won't try and name them. And obviously, I do receive quite a lot of chastisement from various people saying, but they know stories of the Botswana in here, and they know stories of this particular group or that particular group. What about telling our stories?
Well,
and I hope over the next 5 to 7 years we'll be able to cover those as well.
One of the things for people that have never seen the Heritage series, it's beautifully illustrated. It visually is absolutely amazing. You've got a map when you open the book that kind of positions the story for you. Talk to me about the creative element of putting this together, because it could have been easy just to tell the story and not think of it visually how it would be represented.
Yeah, well, I must say, when we first looked at the series, we were thinking particularly about South Africans whose mother tongue is not English. And, of course, the reason why we selected English was if we told these stories in our indigenous languages, then they would only be accessible to speakers and readers of those languages. The next thing was to make, after making sure that the language level was appropriate for English first additional language speakers, was to ensure that we could lure reluctant readers into the text through, hopefully, very attractive illustrations. We thought that would stimulate their curiosity to find out what was going on in these illustrations. Why was this elderly woman locked in a hut with a hyena? and so the youngsters would begin to read the text and find them very interesting.
And you know, it's funny that you said it was geared towards a younger audience. I definitely don't tick the box of a younger audience. But I found that the story appealed to me, and I don't know how deliberate it was that you wrote a story that could sit comfortably with a certain grade, but also if you didn't know the history of South Africa and you were interested and fascinated by these things, it could also speak to you at your level. And I found that these stories were really well put together, seriously crafted, incredibly well. Was that a conscious thought at the beginning, the same way you thought about using the English language as opposed to the indigenous languages?
Yeah, as I said, it was originally conceived for the younger reader, but certainly the biggest audience we have thus far is adult South Africans. And a lot of people are saying to me, it's because we simply can't source information on our past. And I think that may have a lot to do with it. Clearly, there is quite a lot of information about the past of all South Africans locked within oral tradition, which is, as you know, rapidly dying around the country, but also in academic institutions. But the written material is often inaccessible to the average South African. And this series has been designed as a non-threatening, easy introduction to the past of this country and its people.
I want to use your words, Terence, non-threatening, because I really thought about it leading into this conversation, because I've read Mzilikazi 1, I've read Mzilikazi 2, I've read Maqoma 1, and I've read 2. I've got copies of those, and I read Soshangana. So for me,
yes,
when you talk about non-threatening, how important was it for you as the person who wanted to tell the stories not to take a position, but to tell the actual story, to find a storyteller who would be, for lack of a better description, neutral as they told the story and not try and position the story in a certain way that becomes, obviously each of these stories are emotive, but that is not emotive in a negative sense, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yes. Yeah. Well, obviously, we, as you'll see, we don't credit any authors on individual books because we do believe that these books are born of a team effort. The authors, the illustrators, the editors that I've spoken about, those who might be involved in some rewriting to an extent. Our objective was to try and make sure that as many readers as possible would find these books interesting and appealing. One hopes that is the case now.
You obviously talked to us about the fact that you traveled and that the fact you were able to tell these stories and that there's so many other stories. But I want to go back to the very first story that you published and why you decided to tell that story first when you had had access to so many other stories.
Okay, right. There was no question in my mind that the first story should be the Battle of Umhlatuzi River, which, as I said earlier, took place in northern KwaZulu-Natal close to 200 years ago. The reason for that is that it led to the flight of the Amandwandwe from northern KwaZulu-Natal. They relocated to northern Swaziland, Mbombela. Zwide Kalanga was the Nkosi Kakhulu of the Ndwandwe. And Shoshangan, for reasons we don't understand fully, left Zwide and went into Mozambique, where he founded the Amashangana nation. And obviously the Chitsonga that we know today would be more influenced by the Chitsonga as was spoken there. That is speculative, I must say, but I think it's a reasonable speculation. Zwangindaba Kajele went right up to Zambia, Malawi, where he founded the Ngoni nation. And the language obviously is still very similar to isiZulu. They practice Nkwala, they practice Umhlanga. And in the aftermath of that battle, Mzilikazi Kamashobane fled KwaZulu-Natal. So one can argue that 3 nations were born of that battle, and certainly, 2 languages. And that's what made it so important for me, because it's one of the earliest events to take place in this country that still have a direct impact on where people live in South Africa.
We're about to take an ad break, but when I come back, I want to have a chat to you about just some of the titles and some of the stories. Like as I mentioned, I've read 4 of the books. I've been fortunate enough to get a couple of copies, and I've shared them with 1 or 2 people. So I want to talk to you about, like, Mikado, for example, Defender of the Bavenda. And then there's also Hope's War. There's Siege of Mafikeng. There's Mzila the Survivor. There's Dimbanyika. There's Meeting Shaka. And then, of course, Mzilikazi 3. So let's take an ad break quickly on the weekly. And when we come back, we'll have a chat to Terence Paul, who's the publisher for Heritage Publishers.
brandlive.co.za.
What about the power of social media? Social media has the power to make your business grow. Grow! Yeah. Why don't you let us manage your social media? Because our business is to see your business grow. Visit us at www.bstownmedia.co.za.
Making a bold statement yet blending into the surrounding suburbs of Melville, 27 Boxes is a realization of edgy design and practical implementation. A radical departure from the shopping malls of our generation, yet not a return to the high streets of our youth. 27 Boxes showcases the best of a shopping centre set in a garden, surrounded by the bohemian suburb that is Melville. 27 Boxes, shop, play, eat.
You're listening to The Weekly with me, Sam Marshall, and we've got a very special guest. We are in Heritage Month, and somebody who is, I've got to say, is actually blowing me away with the kind of knowledge and passion that he has for our African stories. Of course, I'm talking to Terence Paul from Heritage Publishers. Terence, thank you yet again for being with us, and it's such a treat to talk to you. I read Mzilikazi 1, a Kamalo Prince. And, considering that he was one of those that defied Shaka and eventually had to flee with these people. That story for me and the way you tell these stories that, and obviously you talked about the authors and the writing process, but you have found such a humanistic way of telling the story that in Heritage Month, it feels to me like these are the kind of books that everybody should be buying. Well, not throughout the year, of course, but more for me in Heritage Month, we should be really talking about these things.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, you've touched on something that you asked me just before the ad break, and I think one of the reasons why the Our Story series works so well is that most of the stories, as you'll know, you've read them, are told through the medium of a traditional storyteller. And in fact, the Shoshangan book starts with the storyteller calling children from, their play late in the evening, telling them to call their mothers from the fields. The time has come for me to tell you a story of our great ones of the past. And that medium also allows us to deal with some of the contradictory information that we come across concerning certain events. So the storyteller can say, my young ones, some will tell you that this is what happened thereafter, while others will tell you something slightly different. So I hope that has made the stories more accessible, and I hope that it was an approach that you found interesting.
Yeah, I did. And the other thing that I also found interesting is that for me, I look at the visuals, I look at the book, and I'm thinking, why is this not a TV series? Why is this not being animated? Why is this not? Because look at Mzilikazi, it's 3 parts. I mean, the first part, it deals with him fleeing. The second part, it deals with him settling down near the Crocodile River, which is present day Tshwane. And I mean, there's some really great stories here. And I think this is the kind of stuff that the SABCs of the world, the ETVs of the world, the DSTVs, they have to get their hands on this content and develop it alongside with Heritage Publishers.
It's something that I would obviously love to do because, as you know, it's not enormously hard work to convert these stories into drama scripts. And yes, I would love to see that happening. I think that we need to tell people more about their past, because it is a past that they can feel justly proud of, and it's certainly something I think that all South Africans can feel proud about. It's just taking the time, to find out a bit about that past, and it adds so much value to any trips that you'll make into the parts of South Africa that you read about. I'm, really anxious to try and get more people to visit Zata, the ruins near Thohoyandou in Venda. Go and see where Thohoyandou built his village. See if you can get permission to go to Lake Fundudzi. And you were talking earlier on about Makhado. And just as an aside, I started with the story of Vuwani, and that it was originally called Lokati van Taban in the late 1800s. Well, the reason it got that name is that Makhado's brother Taban.
Terence, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you talked about Vuwani.
Yes, and Makhado's brother Davana had to flee after Makhado took the throne of the Vavenda. And he went to that part of the world, and of course the North Sotho speakers couldn't pronounce Davana, so he was called Taban. And Lokati van Taban is a reference to Makhado's brother Davana.
I want to just ask you personally, what has this journey been like for you? You've always traveled, you've always had the ability to connect with people, but what has this journey been like, telling these stories?
It's been absolutely extraordinary, and I know I'm going to sound completely eccentric. You might want to, you might ask yourself why you have me on the air. But one of the things that I do is I go to the old sites where those ancestors lived, where the battles were fought, and I lay before them my thoughts and ideas. And it comes together remarkably well. I won't go into any of the detail here, but I don't think that I'm doing this alone somehow.
Mm. You've stumbled onto, and I use this word quite loosely, but not in disrespect to you, but you've stumbled onto something for me that is really a gem. And as we move more and more as a nation, as people, to trying to understand who we are, I find your books are going to become more and more relevant, especially as we are questioning our education system, how much of it has to be about our own history as opposed to the kind of history we've been fed for a very, very long time. Do you get that sense from feedback?
Yes, I do. And the feedback that I have got has been fairly limited in number if we're talking about mass market bestsellers, but has been deeply passionate and deeply enthusiastic. And I think I've literally only had two expressions of concern, and that was around various issues that were raised in two of the books. But obviously we do make it clear to our readers that they should not trust one source of information about their past. Even they should not trust these books. It is possible that there's human error in there. But yes, I think it's a wonderful way of learning about history rather than having to learn dates and facts and names and recite them, to hear these stories and to become interested in stories and to discover more on that journey of discovering the past by yourself.
Now, I know you've aimed this at educating children. You've had a lot of feedback from adults. What has government been saying? Have you been approached by municipalities, by libraries, people wanting the content?
Yes, that is beginning to happen now in increasing quantity, because I've been urging them to set up activities around Heritage Month. Again, as you rightly said, you can do it throughout the year, where learners come to the libraries and somebody reads these stories to them, and a historian tells them about how the very areas in which they by these events. And the Department of Education, I'm afraid, has been a little sort of slow and tardy. They feel that the books are not yet approved, and they will wait for one of the opportunities that publishers are given to approve the books. And I rather feel that they should be in the hands of the learners.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, it's been quite slow from that point of view. And also, I must say that the Heritage Council was initially very enthusiastic, but clearly they have other things on their plate. But what I must say is what thrills me greatly is that we heard about 3-4 months ago that the entire series has been bought by the Library of Congress in the USA.
Wow.
And catalogued by them. And I believe that this is a relatively sort of rare event. And I'm really excited about that. But as we are saying in our catalogues, we hope now that the story of our ancestors will find a place in our libraries and schools and homes.
I do want to say I do want to say that they're reasonably priced. And if you're interested, where could people go if they're interested in copies? I know you can go onto your website, heritagepublishers.co.za.
Correct. Yes. And then I would ask members of the public to go to their local booksellers. Just that they do. Because we are trying to put stock into the bookshops, but the bookshops complain about how difficult trading conditions are at the moment and are reluctant to stock.
Yeah, you're dipping out a little bit there at the end. You were saying that some of the booksellers are complaining about how difficult it is to move stock.
Not to move stock out. They don't want to put money into stock, invest in stock. It's that trading conditions are quite difficult. And so, they are wanting quite extortionate terms, in my opinion, which would add to the cost of the books, the price of the books. And I don't want that to happen. Yeah. So I would ask your listeners to, go to local bookshops and insist that they order these books for them.
That's fantastic, and I'm going to encourage everybody for Heritage Month to really think about buying the entire collection. And I must admit that I think if you want something really alternative and something that kind of stretches the brain of your little one, this is the perfect series of books to get. And I suspect that it's a conversation starter.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it certainly started a lot of conversations with the people that, I come into contact with and that I get people I get to read the books prior to publication to get feedback from. It just gives one so much more to talk about and gives one so much more of an understanding of as I say, the country when you're driving through it, on the way through Harrismith, on the way of the Batlokwa lived in that area, and that they were attacked by the Amahlubi, and that's also coming up for 200 years. So I just think it adds a sort of three-dimensional aspect, if you like, to any country trips that you make, knowing what happened in that vicinity and thinking about those events and the sacrifices of our ancestors.
Well, Terence Ball, thank you very much for your time. We've run out of time, but for those that are interested in the entire collection, I would urge you to get the entire collection. It's not good enough to just get one. Go to www.saheritagepublishers.co.za. You'll find all the information and the details there. You'll even find a little foreword from Terence Ball, the publisher. And let's invest in proudly local ideas. And a story like this needs to be shared and told by absolutely everybody. Terence Ball, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, that's the end of the weekly. You can catch us again on Thursday where we will talk relationships. But to find out more, I'll repeat that website for you very quickly. It's www, let me not swallow the words, saheritagepublishers.co.za.
brandlive.co.za. Guess who got brands talking? brandlive.co.za. Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.